Welcome to our last chapter of the semester, Chapter 18, 14th Century Art in Europe. And many of the things that are on these slides for this chapter, I actually got to see this past summer on a trip to Italy. So you'll have to excuse me if I insert some of my own personal commentary every now and again. So, this is from the City Hall of Siena, and in 1338, the Siena City Council of Merchants and Bankers, referred to as the Council of Nine, commissioned Ambrogio Lorenzetti to paint a fresco mural depicting the results of good and bad government on the walls of the Palazzo Pubblico, or City Hall. It came at a time of the greatest prosperity and security since government was established in Siena in 1287. The moral foundation of good government unfolds like a tableau and references the Last Judgment, equating secular rule with divine authority. On the short wall that we are seeing in front of us, Ambrogio painted a figure symbolizing the commune of Siena, enthroned like an emperor and holding an orb and scepter and surrounded by the virtues: justice, strength, prudence, temperance, and magnanimity. They oversee the local magistrates, personifications of his patron, the Council of Nine. Peace lounges on a bench against a pile of armor, having defeated war. Bad government is represented on the other wall, featuring cruelty, treason, fraud, fury, division, and war. Within a decade of the completion of the mural, the bubonic plague wiped out the area and the rule of nine collapsed. The utopian ideal of good government remained the ideal over the next 2 centuries. And here is our map. By the middle of the 14th century, many factors contributed to Europe being in a crisis. The population had exceeded its food production, and to make matters worse, there was a few years of famine due to poor harvests. The 100 Years' War from 1337 to 1453 erupted between France and England, and the Black Death wiped out 40% of the population. The surviving peasants and artisans were able to demand higher wages. In the church, there was the Great Schism, from which 2 popes, one in France and one in Rome, emerged, each claiming legitimacy and excommunicating the other's followers. Secular rulers from neighboring countries took sides. Additional challenges came from reformers like John Hughes from Bohemia. A cultural explosion took place in the 14th century in literature, poetry, language, and painting. Literary figures like Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, artists Cimabue, Doccio, and Giotto thrived during this time. Poets like Petrarch wrote in Italian, marking its first use as a literary language in place of Latin. Giotto, in his mural paintings, observed people around him and emphasized the emotions and dignity in their gestures and forms. This new interest in classical learning in literature, with an emphasis on humanity, we now refer to as humanism. This new worldview focused on human beings and an education that perfected individuals through the study of past models of civic and personal virtue, and emphasize values such as effort and responsibility and physical activity directed to the common good of man, as well as individual nobility. An appreciation of Greek and Roman writers and the Greek and Latin languages, including the newly discovered works of history, biography, poetry, letters, and orations, were the models from which they drew from. The Gothic style of architecture was still popular. However, the devastation from the 100 Years' War and the Black Death ended large-scale construction. Small churches, municipal buildings, and private residences were built during this period. Artisans' guilds gained economic and political power, and the apprenticeship system was developed. Admission to a guild came after an exam and the creation of a masterpiece by the artist. Major guilds included cloth finishers, wool merchants, silk manufacturers, pharmacists and doctors, sculptors and metalworkers. Painters belonged to the pharmacy guild, probably because they used mortars and pestles to grind their colors for paint. Guilds provided social services for their members, including taking care of the sick and paying for funerals. Each guild had its own patron saint and maintained a chapel. Artists emerged as individuals due to their ability to work with patrons, wealthy merchants, bankers, and churches. They worked in their own studios and achieved a level of confidence and individuality, encouraging innovation. Medieval Italian cities were built on a hilltop, surrounded by a walled citadel, and houses were clustered around a church, opening into a city square. However, in Florence, because it was an ancient Roman city, was rectangular, and with the cathedral at the northeast corner and the Piazza del Signore, which we are looking at, stood at the other end of the street. This faces a large square or piazza, the town square. Benci di Cione and Simeon Talenti constructed a loggia, or large open-air gathering place with benches for ceremonies and public gatherings between 1376 and 1382, which is now called the Loggia dei Lanzi, or Loggia of the Lancers. And this still looks just like this in Florence. This was one of the places that I visited. The Florence Cathedral, or Duomo, is a significant part of Florence and has a long history. In front of the Duomo is a baptistry of San Giovanni, which contains these gilded bronze doors. Andrea Pisano was awarded this prestigious commission, which took 6 years to complete and depict 20 scenes from the life of John the Baptist, set on 8 personifications of the virtues. The reliefs are framed by quatrefoils, the 4-lobed frames first introduced at the Cathedral of Amiens in France. The figures are shown in a classic style inspired by Giotto, but they also reflect the soft curves of Gothic forms. Pisano's style brings the quiet dignity to the poses, and the result is the illusion of three-dimensionality. The bronze vine scrolls are filled with flowers, fruits, and the fruits and birds are added in the mid-15th century. And these are extremely impressive in person. This picture just does not do it justice. And they're very large, like 19 by 17 is each panel, but the whole door is probably about 8 feet tall. This is a scene from the doors, and it takes place within a quatrefoil that becomes a stage with a rocky ledge in the background, showcasing the three-dimensionality of the forms. The graceful gestures of the body in drapery folds are typical of French Gothic art, but the quiet dignity of the figures are attributed to the style of Pisano. So now that you see these up close, you see what I'm talking about. They're each this detailed. In both Florence and the city of Siena, a school of painting that had origins in the Byzantine style and the humanized Greek manner was noted to have elements such as elongated figures, exaggerated gestures, contrasting highlights and shadows, often made more striking by the use of gold leaf for drapery folds and the modeling of individual forms. This painter, named Ceni di Pepi, known by the nickname of Cimabue, painted the Virgin and Child enthroned, presumably for the main altar of the Church of Santa Trinity in Florence. It is almost 12 feet tall and shows the traditional Byzantine iconography of the Virgin pointing the way, while holding the infant Jesus in her lap and pointing to him as the path to salvation. Mother and child are surrounded by saints, angels, and Old Testament prophets. These figures have the Byzantine formulas in the placement of their features and the tilt of their haloed heads. Mary's gilded throne with inset gems serves as an architectural framework for the figures. Gold lines the drapery of Mary and Jesus' clothing, emphasizing their divinity. The departure from the Byzantine tradition is the consideration of the viewer's perspective, which seems to hover up and down the image, giving it a subtle ambiguity not usually seen in Byzantine painting. This concern for spatial volume, delicate modeling of light and shade, and warmly naturalistic human figures is carried into later Italian painting traditions, greatly impacting Florentine painting. Artists in the 14th and 15th century worked in tempera paint, which was powdered pigment mixed with egg yolk, water, and a tiny bit of glue. This is the same subject done by Giotto, but done about 1310 for the Church of the Ognissanti, or All Saints, in Florence. It depicts a groundbreaking, realistic, and solid spatial relationships between the planes. The composition is symmetrical, and the figure's position resembles Cimabue's painting. However, Christ sits on Mary's lap, her head is not tilted down, and her gesture of holding her child's leg instead of pointing to him is more natural. She is larger in this painting, her solid blocky form filling up the narrow tabernacle, and the figures and halos on the side have to overlap to fit in. The figures are rendered in light and shadow, but not exaggerated. For example, the gold folds in Mary's drapery is eliminated so they look three-dimensional as they inhabit real space. The angels have ample wings which are folded over in a resting position. Two techniques commonly used in mural painting at this time are buon, or true fresco, or fresh, in which paint is applied with water-based paints on wet plaster, and fresco secco, or dry, in which paint is applied to a dry plastered wall. The two methods could be used on the same wall painting. Buon fresco is more durable because the paint bonds with the pigments into the wall when it dries. However, the disadvantage is that the artist must work quickly without mistakes. The painter must plaster and paint only as much as can be completed in a day. In Italy, each section was called a giornata, or day's work. A wall to be frescoed was first prepared with a rough, thick undercoat of plaster. When this was dry, the assistants copied the master's painting's composition onto it with charcoal. These drawings were called synopia. Work proceeded in irregularly shaped sections according to the contours of major figures and objects. Assistants covered one section at a time with a fresh, thin coat of very fine plaster over the synopia, and when this was set, but not dry, the artist could work with pigments mixed with water. The artist worked from top down, so that the drips fell on unfinished portions. Areas requiring pigments such as ultramarine blue or gilding would be added after the wall was dry, using the fresco secco method. It is believed that Giotto collaborated on several murals, including the ones at the prestigious Church of St. Francis of Assisi and at the Church of St. Anthony in Padua. He was influenced by the Franciscans at Florence, especially St. Francis's teaching of simple, humble devotion, the direct experience of God, the love for all creatures, a philosophy that had a powerful impact on 13th and 14th century Italian literature and art. While in northern Italy, he was approached by a local banker, Enrico Scriveni, to decorate a family chapel, which was dedicated in 1305 to the Virgin of Charity and the Virgin of the Annunciation. The Scriveni family fortune was amassed from the practice of usury, lending money and charging interest, which was illegal at that time. Building this chapel was to atone for the family's sins, and actually resulted in absolution from Pope Benedict IX. The building is a simple barrel-vaulted room with the story of Mary and Jesus unfolding in a series of rectangular panels. The room is set on a base of faux marble with paintings of the virtues and vices that support vertical bands painted to resemble marble inlay in carved relief containing quadrifoil portrait medallions. A central band of medallions spans the vault, which is painted like a star-spangled sky. The upper band of images tell the story of the life of the Virgin Mary. Following in historical sequence, events in the life and ministry of Jesus circle the chapel in the middle band, and the scenes of the Passion fill the lowest band. On the entrance wall is a painting of the Last Judgment. In here, we see the marriage at Cana, raising of Lazarus, resurrection, and lamentation, one section of wall that shows the four narratives. There is commentary and symbolism as the story unfolds. The first miracle, when Jesus changes water into wine during the wedding feast at Cana, foretells that his blood will become the wine of the Eucharist. The raising of Lazarus becomes a reference to Jesus' resurrection. Below, the lamentation over the body of Jesus leads to the resurrection, indicated by angels at the empty tomb and his appearance to Mary Magdalene. The juxtaposition of dead and live trees in the two scenes symbolize both death and resurrection. The figures and their color and mass are what draw us into the drama in these scenes, and Giotto uses intense hues to create the sense of depth. In the lamentation panel, the off-center composition draws the viewer to the emotional expressions on the faces. The one dead tree emphasizes the symbolism of death. This scene depicts real human suffering, despair, and grief, and the symbolism merely echoes the drama. The faces show emotion, and the gestures of the body are true to life. This shows Franciscan values carried into the painting of this period by Giotto. In Siena, painters favored the pictorial, narrative Byzantine style, but emphasized jewel-like colors and elegant poses, and used brilliant colors and applied gold. Duccio di Buonasegna, Siena's most famous painter, painted a huge altarpiece for the high altar of the Siena Cathedral. This entire town is dedicated to the Virgin. We spent the day in Siena and saw this church, saw the Siena Cathedral, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful little village. This altarpiece was an incredible undertaking considering its size and scope of work. The central panel was 7 by 13.5 feet, painted on the front and the back. This is the front, showing Mary and Christ adored by angels and the four patron saints of Siena who are kneeling in front. Narrative scenes from the early life of the Virgin and the infancy of the Christ child appear below the central image. The predella, or the lower zone, was painted with the events in the childhood of Jesus. The back of the work showed scenes of his adult life and the miracles. The piece was topped by pinnacles, which were painted with angels and the later life of the Virgin on the front, and on the back, events after the Passion. The style of Duccio was a softened Byzantine figure with a very lineal composition. The figures are solemn and still, the faces natural and in a Gothic style that was typical of the Sienese style. The hues are pastel with primary colors with patterned textiles and touches of gold. The ornate punchwork tool designs on the halos are all characteristic of this style found in Siena. Now in 1771, the altarpiece was broken up and pieces were sold, its parts scattered, some in Siena and others elsewhere. So this is a reconstruction of how the original altarpiece might have looked. Above and below the main tableau are small narrative scenes from the last days of the life of the Virgin and the infancy of Christ. There is an inscription running around the base of Mary's throne that reads, "Holy Mother of God, be thou the cause of peace for Siena, and life to Duccio, because he painted thee thus." On the back of the maesta are episodes from the life of Christ. One of these pieces is in the National Museum in Washington, D.C., by the way. And this is another scene. This is the raising of Lazarus. This scene from the back of the Maesta describes a raising of Lazarus with drama, especially in the expressions on the faces and bodily gestures. Duccio shaded the drapery to make the figures three-dimensional, but it is the bright clothing that gives the scene visual definition, and the folds of the clothing lead the eye from figure to figure. The rocks in the background and the tomb with Lazarus in the foreground give the painting a feeling of space, which Duccio experimented with to show the depth of the scene. And this is also in our country. As you can see, it is in Fort Worth, Texas. And this is a simply stunning altarpiece that is in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. I mean, it is breathtaking. So it is the Annunciation. One of Duccio's most successful followers was Simone Martini, whose famous work, this altarpiece, was commissioned in 1333 and was created in collaboration with his brother-in-law, Lippo Memmi. The angel Gabriel has just arrived and is addressing the startled Virgin, as indicated in the message inscribed in gold leaf in the background, which translates, "Hail, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." The figure's gestures reflect the courtly style of the 13th century Paris. And you can see, as usually with the Annunciation, Mary is shown having been interrupted from reading. She usually has a book, and you can see the book there that she's holding on to. So the next two slides are going to be close-ups of the allegory of good government, one half which is the city and the other half which is the country. And again, this is in Siena, which is a wonderful town, and it's in a city hall. And the murals are faded, but you can still see the painstaking detail. So here we can see in the allegory of good government in the city side, this is the left side, we see the cathedral dome and its striped campanile, and they're visible in the upper left-hand corner, and the streets are filled with productive citizens. The Porta Romana, Siena's gateway leading to Rome, divides the city from the country. Over the portal is a statue of the wolf suckling Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, and legend tells us that Remus's son, Renus, founded Siena. Hovering over the portal is a woman representing security, appearing angel-like, but carrying a scroll in one hand and a miniature gallows in the other. Her scroll asks that everyone entering come in peace, and the gallows stands as a warning to anyone who does not. People stroll and dance, busy living their lives. The painting portrays an orderly society of prosperity, which is realistically rendered with the architecture and landscape flowing together as a backdrop. And here you can see a little bit better. You can see the angel there of security on the left-hand side and a little miniature gallows, which is kind of an interesting image. But anyway, this is the other half, which kind of translates into the country. So the scale and perspective shifts from the city to the country, but the two scenes actually blend together. Now, sadly, famine, poverty, and the Black Plague came only a few years after this work was completed. The pandemic known as the Black Plague wiped out between 40 and 80% of the population, and art historian Millard Mice has theorized the impact it had on Italian art. Besides the fact that it probably killed off many artists, the actual forms became flattened and without a reference to three-dimensional background space or containment within a frame. The subject matter reverted back to portraying traditional religious values. Mice proposes that artists are referencing traditional painting styles, suggesting that the Black Plague was God's punishment for a world slipped into moral decline. Other historians disagree, pointing out that it was a natural progression of change, moving away from the established style. This is the Strozzi altarpiece by Andrea di Cioni, nicknamed Orcagna, and it demonstrates the emerging style. This work portrays the theme of death and judgment, sanctity, and the promise of salvation, showing St. Thomas of Aquinas, ecstasy during Mass, Christ's walk on water to rescue Peter, and the salvation of Emperor Henry II due to his donation of a chalice. The figures are crammed into the individual archways with no background. And this also, this is 9 feet by almost 10 feet, as you can see. And I saw this as well in Santa Maria Novella in Florence, which is another incredible cathedral. And this is actually very, very impressive. But alas, now we leave Italy and we go to France, which is also a very exciting place. So in France, at the beginning of the 14th century, Paris was this fashionable center of good taste, although the French countryside had been ravaged by the 100 Years' War. The feudal system became weakened as townspeople had more economic opportunities. Gothic sculptors and artists found a new market for religious art among wealthy patrons for homes as well as churches. Urban workshops produced large quantities of statues and reliefs in wood, ivory, and precious metal, decorated with enamel and gemstones, much of which was dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Architectural commissions were smaller, such as for chapels rather than cathedrals, or even additions to already existing buildings, like adding on a tower or a spire. At the second half of the 13th century, architects working at the royal court in Paris introduced the French court style, also known as the Rayonnant style. This was characterized by elegance and refinement and technical virtuosity. This style appeared in sculpture and painting, showing elegant figures moving gracefully, or by including miniature architectural elements and elements of landscape. This focus on nature grew into the realism that appeared in the 14th century. By the late 13th century, literacy had begun to spread among lay people. Private prayer books became popular among those who could afford them. These prayer books were called a Book of Hours because they contained special prayers to be recited at the 8 canonical hours between morning and night. The book included everything the lay person needed, including psalms, prayers to the virgins and saints, and a calendar of feast days. During the 14th century, a richly decorated Book of Hours was worn like jewelry and was a noble person's most important portable possession. This is the book that King Charles IV gave his queen, Jeanne d'Evreux, which measures only 3½ by 2¼ inches per page, and was illuminated by Jean Pucelle. It was made in the grisaille technique, using monochromatic painting in shades of gray with faint touches of color used to decorate the drawings. Queen Jean actually appears in the initial below the Annunciation, kneeling and reading. This book of hours combines two narrative cycles: the Hours of the Virgin, with scenes from the infancy and passion of Christ, a form known as the Joys and Sorrows of the Virgin, and the other is dedicated to the recently canonized king, Saint Louis. Here we see the joy of the Annunciation on the right, which is paired with the sorrow of the betrayal and arrest of Christ on the left. In the Annunciation, Mary is receiving the Archangel Gabriel in a Gothic building, while happy angels look on from windows under the eaves. In the betrayal on the opposite page, Judas embraces Jesus, thus identifying him to the Roman soldiers. Children play at the bottom of the page, believed to be playing Froggy in the Middle, a form of tag and a metaphor for the betrayal of Judas, who tags his friends. Pucelle's work represents a sophisticated combination of narrative and symbolism or allegory. There is a representation of architecture that defines the space. The small angels are framed by the rounded arches of the attic. A strong market emerged for personal items like boxes, mirrors, and combs decorated with scenes inspired by literature. A popular theme in literature at this time was romance, portrayed by musician poets known as troubadours. A chest such as this one may have been for courtship gifts or wedding presents. This is made of ivory with metal hardware, originally wrought in silver. There are scenes of romantic allegory on all sides, including the lid. And here's a scene of, here we show the lid, in which there's a scene showing a tournament in front of the Castle of Love. The tournament, a mock battle to keep knights fit for war, has become a lovers' combat. In the center panel, women watch jousting knights charge using crossbows and a catapult to hurl roses at the castle, while the god of love helps the women by aiming his arrow at the attackers. The action concludes in the scene at the right, where the tournament's victor and his lady love meet in a playful joust of their own. This is the Virgin and Child, made between 1324 and 1339. It is 27 1/8 inches tall and is currently in the Louvre in Paris. It is a silver gilt sculpture donated to the Abbey Church of Saint Denis in 1339 by Queen Jean of Devereux, the same one who owned the Book of Hours we saw previously. The Virgin holds Jesus in her left arm with her weight balanced on her left leg, resulting in the Gothic S-curved pose. She once wore a crown and still holds the fleur-de-lis, the heraldic symbol of France, which served as a reliquary container for strands of her hair. The Christ child actually looks like a baby here. You might have noticed that in other examples in this chapter, he just looks like a miniature grown-up. But here he actually looks like a baby. On the base, small statues of prophets stand on piers, separating scenes of Christ's life. The apple the baby holds is a reference to his role as the new Adam, redeeming humanity from original sin. This pictorial needlework style, using colored silk and gold thread, became an English specialty and are called opus Anglicanum. The names of specific embroiderers are actually known, but they cannot connect them to specific pieces. This method of textiles was used as vestments, clothing, and furnishings, but most notably They were collected by the popes. This is a liturgical vestment showing the Annunciation, the adoration of the Magi, and the coronation of the Virgin, and resembles the burnished gold-leaf backgrounds of manuscript illuminations. The S-curve-shaped arches are called ogee arches. We also see the twisting branches sprouting oak leaves, seed pearl acorns, and animal masks. The star and crescent moon in the coronation of the Virgin scene are heraldic emblems of Edward III, suggesting that he or a family member may have ordered this vestment for the church. During the celebration of the Mass, these garments would have glinted in the candlelight along with the treasures on the altar. Also worth noting is the fact that these garments would be very heavy. The decorated style is the English version of the Rayonnant style in France. It has been credited to Henry III's ambition to surpass his brother-in-law, Saint Louis of France, also a royal patron of the arts. This church is the most complete decorated style building and is credited to Thomas of Whitney, who was the master mason and the supervisor of construction. He was responsible for the nave and the redesigning of the upper parts of the choir. He left the original towers, but turned the interior into a series of colonnettes, moldings, and vaulted ribs. Diamond-shaped piers covered with colonnettes have massed moldings rising out of them, giving the impression of a rippled effect. Groups of colonnettes spring from sculpted corbels supporting clusters of 13 ribs that meet at the summit of the 4-part vault with intersecting cross ribs, and with an additional rib called a tierceron that create a rich linear pattern and also that meet 69 feet above the floor. Where the ribs meet, bosses, which are knob-like elements, cover the intersection. Large clerestory windows, sectioned off with mullions, illuminate the 300-foot-long nave. Unpolished gray marble shafts, yellow sandstone arches, and a white French stone used in the upper walls add gradations of color. Thomas of Whitney also designed the bishop's throne, an intricate canopy which is 57 feet high. Richard de Galmatin and Walter of Memberg led the team of a dozen carpenters that built it. It looks like a piece of embroidery made from wood, with characteristic forms of the decorated style, including S-curves, nodding arches, which are called nodding ogee arches because they curve outward and nod, lead the eye into a maze of pinnacles with leafy crockets and tiny carved animals and heads. The wood is gilded and painted. When the bishop was seated on his throne, wearing embroidered vestments, he must have looked like a golden shrine. During the years following the Black Death, work in the cathedral came to a halt. When work resumed, the style had changed to a more austere rectilinear pattern with angular shapes called the perpendicular style. The east window was rebuilt in this new style by master mason Robert Lesingham. A single figure in each light stands under a tall painted canopy that blends into the stone tracery. The Virgin with the Christ child stands in the center over the high altar with 4 female saints at the left and 4 male saints, including St. Peter, to whom the church is dedicated, on the right. The figures at a distance create a band of color, showing off the rectangular pattern of the mullions and transoms. And here we see quite a different image than the Madonna and Child of some of the other examples found in this chapter. The ordeals of the 14th century, famines, wars, plagues, inspired a mystical fanaticism that emphasized ecstatic joy and extreme suffering. Devotional images such as these, known as Andachtsbilder in German, were meant to evoke contemplation of Jesus' first and last hours, especially during evening prayers or vespers. That is why this style has also been called Vesperbild, or Mary mourning her Son. Through these religious exercises, worshippers hope to achieve understanding of the divine union with God. Here we see blood gushing from the horrible rosettes that are Jesus' wounds. The Virgin's face conveys the intensity of her ordeal. Such images had a profound impact on later art, both within Germany and beyond. Prague and the Holy Roman Empire under Charles IV had become a multicultural empire where people of different religions lived side by side. When he died in 1378, political and religious dissent overtook the empire. Charles IV of Bohemia, who ruled from 1346 to 1376, was crowned King of Bohemia in 1347 and Holy Roman Emperor in 1355. He established his capital in Prague, which replaced Constantinople as the new Rome. When Pope Clement VI made Prague an archbishop in 1344, construction began on a new cathedral in the Gothic style, to be named for Saint Vitus, which also served as a coronation church. However, at Charles' first coronation, the choir was unfinished. Charles brought in Peter Parler from Swabia to complete the building. He came from a distinguished family of architects, beginning with his father, Heinrich Parler. Heinrich designed and began building the Church of the Holy Cross in Germany. Peter designed the choir in the manner of a hall church, in which a triple-aisled form was enlarged by a ring of chapels between the buttresses of the choir. The space was unified by the complex net vault, which consisted of a web of ribs, as seen here, that formed a star. And here is our last slide. This is called the beautiful style. Master Theodoric was head of the Brotherhood of St. Luke, the patron saint of painters. He was responsible for painting about 30 images for the chapel at the Karlstein Castle built by the emperor. 130 paintings were also on display there, and they served as reliquaries, for they had relics inserted into their frames. Here we see St. Luke accompanied by his symbol, the ox, and it's possibly a self-portrait of Master Theodoric in his personal style. This style included heavy bodies, oversized heads and hands, haunted faces, and soft, deeply modeled drapery merged with the French Gothic style to become what is known as the beautiful style. The chapel was consecrated in 1365, and the emperor was so pleased with the results that he gave the artist a farm in appreciation for his work. This style spread through Central and Northern Europe, along with the architecture of the Parler family. And that concludes Chapter 18.